Hello, friends. I'm here with author KB Hoyle, and she's been gracious enough to join us as we continue to just cultivate what it means for us as a church to honor artists and to listen to them. And I'm so excited for you and for me, frankly, to hear a little bit more about her work, about some of the influences and what has inspired her to move towards these certain ways of writing, these certain mediums. And so, KB, thanks so much for joining us, first of all.
Thanks for having me on. I'm happy to be here.
So grateful you're here. So I do just want to give you some space to introduce what you do, some of the work that you've done, and so could you just give us the snapshot of? I know you have a couple different series and some other places that you're writing. So where, just kind of on the front end here, where can people find you, and maybe some brief summaries of some of those works?
Yeah. Okay. So, as you mentioned, I'm an author. I write primarily for young adults, but everybody seems to be reading young adult these days. So, don't let that deter you from picking up one of my books. I have written, this always gets a little tricky for me because I'm trying to remember everything that I've written, because everything I've written is unfortunately not published yet. I have written something like 12 novels, but 10 of them are currently published. I have a 6 book fantasy series that's kind of geared towards that teen audience, teen tween audience. And that series is called The Gateway Chronicles. And that's about a group of teenagers who go to a summer camp and they stumble through a magic gateway to another world and discover that, lo and behold, they've been expected for hundreds of years to show up and save the day. And I had some fun working with the gateway fantasy kind of trope, and what it would mean. Everybody's kind of familiar with that because of Narnia. Um, but working with what that would mean for a group of 13-year-old American teenagers, how would they handle being dumped in another world and not being able to use, smartphone technology and things like that? How would they respond to magic? How would they respond to this notion that hey, there's this big evil force and you have to take care of it. And that's that's the meta narrative. So the 6 books in that series, each book follows a year in the adventure. So they get stuck there for a year, and then there's a little bit of time travel involved because when they they go back to the exact same point in time at which they left. So there's that series, and then I also have a 4 book dystopian series. People always kind of look at me funny and say, "Dystopian, what is that?" And then I say, "Oh, it's like the Hunger Games," and then people go, "Oh, okay." So dystopian is a futuristic society where everything has gone wrong. And my series is set. 3 of the books are set about 200 years in the future, and then one of them is a prequel novel that's supposed to be set, about 30 years ish in the future from where we are now. Ironically, it deals with the pandemic. I did not know where we were going to be when I published it. And I published the prequel novel like at the very end of 2019, and then 2020 hit and I was like, "Oh man, this is too real." Um so that just deals with me playing around with concepts. The whole series deals with me playing around with concepts of, what if there were 3 great devastations that hit the earth? Where did they come from? How did aspects of humanity survive? What do they mean? How do people rise up and overthrow an oppressive government? Which are very common, again, dystopian themes, which you pick up a dystopian novel, you're looking to find certain things. So um, that's what I did, but I tell a unique story while doing that. And then the prequel novel tells the story of one of the devastations. Um, it actually does not tell a story of the pandemic, but the pandemic is mentioned. And then it kind of talks about how the world fell into being in a dystopian state. So I have those 2 series currently available. and some other books that are finished. And I'm looking for new agent representation at this time, so I'm shopping things around. I also write for a online publication called Christ in Pop Culture. I have a column called Storied that publishes usually every other week on Tuesdays, where I analyze stories wherever they're found: television, movies, books. Sometimes I'll write about a song. That's pretty rare, though. Just felt I should toss that out there. So yeah, I'm kind of I all over doing lots of things. Oh, I have a website, kbhoyle.com. That's where you can find links to
That's
all
good.
my things.
That's good. Thank you for all that. I know people usually put that at the end. I'm always like, well, like, not everybody listens to the end.
Right. If someone
So,
gets bored, they're gonna leave.
right. Yeah. So now we
So
got that. Everybody can, and I trust this audience can also use Google. So
right.
please, KB Hoyle, find her work. And we're so grateful that you're here. And just really want to explore some of these intersections of, fantasy writer, dystopian writer, and follower of Jesus, and trying to sort of tell the story in such a way that invites people in. And this has a long and storied history of its own. Jesus came telling stories, and
Yep.
maybe we'll get into some of the reasons of that. But I do want to just talk about your journey as a writer and your sense. William Stafford, the poet, talks about, he's like, all of us are born poets, just some of us never stop. So did you have that sense of just like, this has always been something that's been kind of in your orbit, or was this something that you kind of stumbled into, or what was that journey like as you began to say, I'm a writer?
Oh yeah, no, this was always in my orbit. I was the child. I'm always telling this story every time I go on podcasts and do, you know, talks at schools and whatnot. I mean, not this past year, but I was the child who read the Chronicles of Narnia and wanted, I would go into my closet and push on the back wall to try to get to Narnia. Not that I believed that Narnia actually existed. The rational part of my brain knew there was no such place as Narnia. But Lewis wrote in such a way that his stories had an inner consistency of reality. Um, they felt real, even as a very young child, I knew that it was fantasy. Um, I wanted to capture that same feeling, to recapture that same feeling, to feel that way over and over again. And I knew intrinsically, Lewis is the first author I can recall who did this for me. I knew intrinsically that it could be found in stories. And as I found it in reading, but then I also found it in writing, most especially because I'm always telling kids, like, y'all don't know how good you have it these days. You've got tons of, great fantasy literature to choose from. Because for me, it was more fantasy than other genres, although it exists in other genres too. But I was like, when we were kids, I don't know how old you are, but I'm 38. When I was a child of the 90s and born in 83, and it's like there wasn't much to choose from in the way of really good fantasy literature. It was like the Chronicles of Narnia, The Hobbit, and George MacDonald had some stuff out there, Madeline L'Engle, but it was like you would read what was there and then you would just go back and reread because there it just wasn't a booming, you know, um, genre of literature for children. And so it was hard to find stories that really scratched that itch of feeling. Lewis calls it sensucht, that place, that idea that you are looking for this home, that you've a longing for home, that a place you've not yet been to, but it is home. And so I had this keen awareness that I wanted to write stories like that, partially because I couldn't find more stories like that. And so I kept having to reread the ones that I loved. Um, and I loved Harry Potter when it came out, but I was older when Harry Potter came out. I was a teenager. And Harry Potter did the same thing for me, but again, I was a teenager when it came out, so it wasn't the same thing as being a very young child. I'm waiting for my owl from Hogwarts. So I um, started writing my first novel when I was like 12 years old. I
Wow.
just sat down and started trying to do it. Um, I did eventually finish that. I mean, it took me like 10 years, but it it did eventually finish that book. It's terrible as you would expect, but I did it.
Mm.
So it was a longing that was with me my whole life.
Mhm. That's that's really beautiful, and I wanna get into a couple of things you said, like, this sense of, like, saturation of story, right? And so we've already
Mhm.
talked about, like, you do not only you create stories, but you're also reflecting on, just like, the inundation of story that we have, like, every week, Netflix is like, "Hey, you might
Yeah.
try this,"
Did you like that?
or
You like this too? Yeah.
that's right. Or now there's 40 other streaming services that,
Yeah.
maybe someday somebody will bundle them all together and I guess we'll have cable again. But it's like this sense of like story in our modern world is almost like it's just like everywhere. And even then, so you have social media where then everybody is offering their personal narratives and really cultivating their personal image. And that's kind of what social media is. It's like, here's what
Yeah.
I want you to see. And so you have this like just complete saturation. And so for you as somebody who is a caretaker of stories, like how do you see the purpose of modern, like of story in the modern world? Like what does it mean for stories to mean something in our day and age when there's just so many of them?
It can be really difficult to find the good ones because we
Mm,
have an oversaturation. Um, and sometimes what is good goes overlooked because we have so much. Boy, I have a lot of thoughts about this, and I need to kind of sift through what does it mean? What does story mean in the modern age? Well, okay, let me kind of go back to the basic. Let me just kind of stick to the basic question here first. Um, Story shapes culture, but story is also a
mm,
reflection of culture. Um, I think about this often as a writer of young adult literature, which is really anything from middle grade, which is intended for, ages 8 to 12, to new adult, which is intended for college age adults.
mhm.
So when I think about story and story's importance in shaping and reflecting culture, um, and I think about that umbrella of young adult age group and stories, um, it kind of makes me a little upset sometimes because the young
Yeah.
adult audience is often looked down on
Mm,
because as if the stories that are written for them are not serious stories. They're not worth they're not worthy of serious reflection, serious review, serious contemplation. If you write for a young adult audience, you must not be, a serious storyteller, because if
mhm.
if you were, you'd be writing, high art for adult audiences and things of that sort. This
Yeah.
is a prevalent attitude. And so young adult literature, well, and if we're trying to talk about like Christian publishing,
Mhm.
young adults have been largely abandoned by Christian publishing
That's
for
interesting.
decades.
Mhm.
Um, and that's a whole other conversation. But there's this sort of, I mean, when it comes to fiction publishing, at least.
Mhm.
And I'm not really even sure. I mean, publishing is a business. And so this idea that we can't make money selling books to young adults, we've tried that, and the books didn't sell. And so there's no young adult divisions, or very few young adult divisions in Christian specific publishing houses. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. But when I bring all this around, it's not a Christian problem. It's not a general market problem, Christian specific problem, or general specific market problem. Stumbling over my words a little bit as I form my answer.
That's all right.
But the young adult audience is, in my opinion, and I know I'm biased because I write for them, but the most important audience to reach with stories. And it's, a trope, but kids shape the future.
Mm-hmm.
And the attitudes, what teenagers believe, if we can just kind of take the middle of the market from 8 to 25 or 26, wherever new adult ends, teenagers, what they believe is being formed much more by the stories they consume, whether it's books, television, music, video games are stories as well, movies,
Yeah.
what they're seeing on TikTok and whatnot. These are all kind of under the story umbrella. All of that is being shaped by the stories they consume in a much larger way than people want to admit. Maybe it's not that they don't want to admit it, that it's just ignored.
Mm-hmm.
So reaching young adult audiences with good stories, or even just paying attention to the stories that they're consuming and treating them as, art, acknowledging the artistry that goes into reaching that audience, that will shape the future. I probably shouldn't use the word change, because I don't want to engage in any sort of culture war here. I don't get away from culture war language.
Yeah, we'll
shape
leave those to other people.
Yeah. I'm done with all that. I grew up in that and done with all that. But it shapes the future.
Yeah.
The attitudes the kids that like adult people have right now, especially as we look at the deconversions and the deconstructions and all that sort of stuff, is it massively affected by books, TV, movies, and music that people were engaged in 10, 20 years ago. So.
Yeah, and it is the sense of, G.K. Chesterton talks about, a world with dragons, a world with monsters, and like what it means to live in such a world, where obviously at some point you give up the ghost, and as you said, like you stop pushing on the back wall looking for Narnia,
right.
But you're still left with this sense of being dropped into the middle of a conflict. And the nature of that conflict will be worked out. And we as modern people often struggle with the idea of powers and principalities and what those entail. But there is this sense, if you read the New Testament, that you're dropped in the middle of this thing as a follower of the way of Jesus. And so, okay, then you have this sense of story and fantasy. And so like beginning to say like, okay, what does it mean for me to inhabit a world such as this? And to begin to explore this world. And I do want to get to that with you, because the thing I started reading the Gateway Chronicles, and especially I started with the first novel, and I'm always amazed. As somebody, I'm a bit of a novice in the genre of fantasy, but one of the things that always blows me away is the extent to which people create worlds. So you do this so well in the book, and I want to talk about that. Like, so it is so much reflective of God in Genesis 1, sort of joyfully narrating the creation. You're doing that. So how do you go from this cursor that's blinking on a page to I'm going to have this world that in some way makes sense, right? It may be fantastical. It may be something that obviously we know can't exist, at least in our conception. but you're going to make this place. Like, how do you even begin to start that construction? What is that process like?
Okay. Um, world building. Uh, well, the world is built around characters.
Mhm.
It's a give and take. It's a push and pull, and there's a lot of discipline that has to go into building your world before you put pen to paper. Um, and boy, this answer will be different. Whatever author you talk to, their answer is going to be different. And I don't want to be that sort of person that says there's only one right way to do this. And if you do it a different way, it's wrong. Um, with the Gateway Chronicles, I had the benefit that the location um, of the camp in the story, the camp is called Cedar
Mhm.
Cove in the story. The location is based on a real place. Um, a camp that I have been to over 20 times. I mean, I went to this camp every summer of my life growing up. Um, so it was very dear and precious to me, and it lives inside my brain, and I can see every detail, every flower, every rock. So the physical location itself, fantasy elements aside, obviously the fantasy elements are built in, but it was very easy to describe. But that's not really what you're talking about when you talk about world building. Constructing a world that is believable. um I always say it's like the movie Inception. Have you ever seen Inception?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so there's this sequence in Inception where the the main character's name is you've got Cobb and you've got Arthur, and they're teaching the new architect to her name is Ariadne in the movie, and they're teaching her to construct dreams. But what they're basically teaching her to do is to build illusions. And
Mhm.
the movie is kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge at the viewer, because what Christopher Nolan is doing is he's really telling the audience of the movie itself, here's how you create false worlds. Here's how you world build. Because when you're writing a story, you are dealing with an audience that knows they're stepping into a reality that's not real. But you want to create secondary belief for the reader while they're in the story. You want them to suspend disbelief when they enter into your story. I mean, like it's not a real place, but when you're in the story, you want to believe that it's a real place while you're reading the story. Anytime you have something, you don't want the reader to run up against the walls of the world, because if they run up against the walls of the world, like in the Truman Show, he hits the
Yeah.
wall of the world. Right, that great scene where the boat hits the
Mhm.
wall of the world, and then he
Mhm.
gets out of the boat and he walks and he opens the door and he leaves. You don't want that to happen with
Mm.
your reader, because all of us, then they don't buy it. And if I hit a point in the book where I'm like, why didn't the character just do this?
Yeah.
I'm done.
The classic horror movie where like just run out the front door.
Yeah, just run out the front door or
Yeah.
run sideways away from the boulder,
which which may
like
be part of the walls of a horror movie. I'm not sure, but
it's there. Yeah, but there are certain expectations you have with certain books, and
yeah.
there are things that you forgive in certain stories because certain stories are certain
Mhm.
ways. But you really, as a writer, the thing is, we are, as Tolkien had invented the world, sub creators. We're sub creators, we're not creators. We're not God. I
Mhm.
cannot create an infinite reality, but what I can do, going back to the movie Inception, is I can create tricks, staircases that don't go anywhere. But you don't want the reader to figure out that they're on a staircase that doesn't go anywhere. You want to create an infinite loop. And so in the pre-writing, I am a diligent pre-writer and planner.
Mhm.
I mean, charts upon charts upon charts, and I write using chiasms um, to make things mirror each other. And I loop
Mhm.
things and color coding, and you just want to you're creating an illusion so that the reader doesn't come up against something that is the wall of the reality, because when that happens they can no longer suspend disbelief, and
Mhm.
then either they put the book down and walk away from it and don't come back to it, or they just get mad at you, and in the
Yeah.
on the odd occasion that they come across something, because you're only human, you know you want them to be able to make a leap of logic and
Hmm.
forgive you for it. And every now and then you wink at your reader, and you're like, I know this doesn't really work, but we're going to pretend it works because this is a fantasy world. Sometimes you
Hmm.
you build MacGuffins into the story to be used in certain ways. I'll never forget the story of Viggo Mortensen on the set of The Lord of the Rings. I think it was his first day there, and they gave him a sword or something, and they were like, do this and battle these guys running at you. And he turned to the sword master and he said, if I really swung the sword at these guys like this, they wouldn't actually fall down like that. And the sword master looked at him and said, oh yes, but this is not real life. This is the movies. And every now and then you have to do things like that for your
Mm.
reader.
Yeah, and it's as you're talking, like, too, just the sense of, like, and obviously, like, so we want to distinguish where the comparisons fall short, but, like, you really just hear these echoes of Genesis 1, right? So as the author, like, okay, so God's not creating an illusion in Genesis 1,
Right.
but he is creating an alternate reality in many ways. Genesis 1 sort of is classically understood is God building a temple for himself. And where does the one who made the world, where does he dwell? Well, he dwells in all the earth. Like, he takes up rest. And people, first, or ancient Near Eastern people reading these kinds of accounts would have known that when gods take up rest, they don't do it, they're not on a couch being lazy. They're,
Right.
they're taking up rest in a temple on a throne.
Yeah.
And but what God is doing, if you read that closely, is he's ordering,
Yeah.
separating things. He's making things work together. And
Yeah.
as you're describing that, I hear so much of that. And I think there's such a beauty there, like, that reflects our impulse to be, as we're made in the image of God,
Yeah.
to establish. And again, this word, especially in our sort of power narrated world where we're dubious of anything, but establish dominion doesn't mean to be to be recklessly using something, not using something to serve our ends, but to steward it and to care
Yeah.
for it. And I loved what you said about characters, because that's sort of the next question I always have, is the element of naming.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you, when you're staring at everyone from the main character in the story to the character that's going to play such a minor role, how do you say, like, that's the name? Like, what's that process like?
Pretty complicated. One, I wanted to, I mean, really quick, to return to something you just said, though, and
Yeah.
this will feed into the naming question. Um, as a Christian who writes, I just knowing that God is a God of order and not of randomness is
Mhm.
one of the main reasons why I am so careful about how I plan my books before I write them, and why I use certain techniques like using a chiasm to plan my books, or to plot the books, narratives, and things like that. I don't believe in randomness in stories. I don't
Mhm.
believe that that's a way for me to properly steward the narrative, to borrow another word that you just used. Um, if I have a good idea and it's worth writing, it's worth telling the story, then I believe I need to do it properly, to the best of my ability with excellence. And so the story should be ordered, um, and logical, rational. Um, and that comes down to, it's a story structure thing. It's a narrative thing, it's a world building thing, and it's down to every little detail, like even naming
Mhm.
characters. Every now and then I'll choose a name. This is rare for me. Every now and then I'll choose a name just because I like it, but that's rare.
Mhm. Mhm.
I'm very particular about names because, um, a name tells you who a person is, you know, who they are, and um, what sort of person they might be, or it tells you something about, a characteristic that they have. Um, every time God changed a person's name in scripture, it meant something. So I
Mhm.
just think it's important. Sometimes it's just to have fun. Some of the names, they all, even if they mean something, sometimes it's just for the fun of it. I have some names that are puns, if you know what if you know what they mean in the Greek, things like that. So I don't think you've run across any of those yet. Okay, they come later in the series.
Okay.
Um,
I'll keep my eye out for them. I feel like
yeah,
I'm taking a
or I'll work.
Greek final. Like, oh man,
Yeah,
missed that one too.
I work in some of my favorite authors' names,
Hmm.
or nods to various
We have,
people.
oh, that's great. And then Aletheia, like the land,
Yeah.
meaning, truth.
Yep. Yep.
And so, I mean, you certainly have that element there, which is not exactly a pun, but it's beautiful in that way.
Yeah, almost every single name in Aletheia means something to tell you about who the person is, or what the place is, what they mean.
Hmm.
Um, and I do that with every character that I name straight on to the end of the series. So, um, and you can tell when a name fits and when it doesn't.
Yeah.
So yeah, Aletheia means truth. Um, and um, Yato Valley's name is
One of the
uh,
characters in the book for those
yeah,
who are soon to read it.
yes. I have these fantasy creatures that are elf like, but they are one. It's two different people, two different consciousnesses. It's always a word I can't say, that inhabit the same body. Um, and one is awake at night and one is awake during the day. So you have a night narc and a day narc. And they have different names. So it's a double name for the character. So Yato is the main narc that you've met so far. There will be others as the series goes on. Well, you've got Vuito Vesa as well, but there will be others as the series goes on. But Yato means blue. Um, and it means the color blue, but obviously he's kind of a puddle glum sort of
Hmm.
character. And then Veli, trying to I named these characters like 12 years ago, something like that. Veli means like pleasant or something like that. Yeah.
Hmm.
So I mean, this isn't any sort of like great, artistic thing that I was doing and naming them. I was just having fun. But I tend to keep journals of possible character names because I've written so many books now, and I'm always working on books. Well, and right now one of the books I'm querying to agents is set. Um, it's a kind of like a Madeline L'Engle sort of story where it's science fantasy, so it takes place in outer space, but it's really a fantasy story, but it just happens to be set in outer space. So I'm
Hmm.
digging into a lot of that medieval astronomical symbolism, which Lewis did a lot of in the Chronicles of Narnia as well.
Hmm.
So I'm having fun with the names there, just choosing, planetary names that have spiritual meanings and symbolic meanings and things like that. So
Yeah, and it's like just hearing you talk, like too, like even just like saying like some of these names are playful, and you just like again like Genesis 2, like I mean, obviously we're now transliterating past like oh what language did Adam speak? We got no idea. But like you look at some of these names of even the animals in the English, like kangaroo, like what is that? Like
yeah.
hippopotamus, like yeah, obviously that's from a Greek word, but like it's like there is this sense where there's this playfulness, and I'm fascinated sort of by the we talked about kind of the world building element, which is like the Genesis one kind of ordering the creation. Then you sort of enter into the story, even as the writer in Genesis 2, where you're more modeling the vocation of humanity and like what it means to name something and what it means to be to have that kind of intimacy at some level where it's like I know you can't name from a distance.
Right.
And there's a sense of like I know what this character is and not real sure what the character will become, but I at least have a sense for what that will be at this point. um, how does that particular element play out as far as characters? When you start, I know you mentioned you're a meticulous planner, but but is there a point where characters really do take on a life of their own, and you're like, well, this person would would choose that, even though maybe the story was sort of going this way. How's that interplay been in your experience?
Well, yes and no. Yes, characters will take on a life of their own. I mean, if they don't, you have a problem. You have an underdeveloped character.
Mm,
And so you need to figure out if that's even a character that's needed in the story, because chances are they're just a meat slab taking up space. Okay.
mm.
And you could probably just absorb them into another person. Um, but I just called somebody a meat
That's
slab.
dark.
I know. No, okay, so but no, because like I always think authors sound a little crazy when they say things like, well, I was gonna have this happen, but then my character told me otherwise. My character decided to do this. I'm like, no, they didn't. Your character does not exist. You are the author. You are in charge of the story. If
Mm,
your character is not talking to you, is not making independent choices, like that's not a thing that happens, everybody. Okay. Um, so here's something that um works into me being a plotter, and how that decides how my characters the decisions that my characters make and things of that sort. And this also addresses the false dichotomy between is your story plot driven or character driven. If you think your story is either plot driven or character driven and it's not both, you have a problem, because your story should be like the plot should be so deeply woven with your characters that um you know the answer should be yes. If people say, is your story plot or character driven? Yes. Okay. um my stories, the Gateway Chronicles is told using an alchemical outline. So each one is a kai, but then I also use an alchemical model, which means that the main character, Darcy, acts as a prima materia in the story, and she needs to be transformed. And there are various characters throughout the story. It's a process of sanctification. So each book,
mm,
she goes through 3 stages of sanctification: Negredo, Albedo, and Rubedo. There are various characters in the story who have to act in various ways to help her on her journey, all right? And at various points in the story. So that dictates their actions to a certain degree. Now, all the pantser writers out there, pantsers are people who write by the seat of their pants and they don't plot at all, are screaming inside right now, like, it's so constricting. I need to just,
mm,
sit down and write and let the story direct me. Okay. But there's nothing constricting about writing the way I'm describing to you. It is freeing. In fact, to me, it is the way that we move and act in this world, which is that don't have, we have free will, of course. We're going to get a little too theological here, get into some sovereignty issues. We have free will, of course, but freedom and free will doesn't mean that we just get to do whatever we want all the time. That's not freedom. That's actually bondage. That's slavery. If we just, are driven by our passions to do whatever we want. I don't let my characters do whatever they want. They have to do what I tell them to do. And within the constraints of the fact that, okay, this is Darcy's albedo stage. This is her purification. These chapters cover her purification stage. She needs help to get from, point, A to point B here. And we're going to have these things happen in the story. Then these characters are albedo characters, side characters that I bring in here. And I might say, well, I've named this character, and I might even determine which characters, which side characters I bring into those chapters.
Mm-hmm.
I might say, Sam is her best good friend. Sam would be a great person to help Darcy through this challenge that she has to overcome to get through the albedo stage in this book,
Can
so
you
that
define that term, albedo?
albedo is purification.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. Oh, and it's so much fun too, because there's all this symbolism involved,
Mm-hmm.
color symbolism and things that they can go through. And that the thing is, you don't even have to be familiar with this type of storytelling for it to act on you in
Yeah.
subliminal ways, to be very satisfying to you.
Mm-hmm.
So that when you read the story, you close it and you feel like, oh, it's a good book, because you're watching a character go through sanctification.
Yeah.
And it has also it ties in also with what characters are named,
Mm-hmm.
because sometimes the names have symbolic meaning. Sometimes the names have informed me about what this character is going to be like. In book 2, I bring in a character who I named Takala, which means fox. And I named him that just whimsically because I said he's really handsome. The girls think he's foxy. So I just named him Fox in the Greek. But then that starts to inform me about what his personality might be like. Maybe he's a little rascally, maybe he's a little sly. And then that tells me, okay, maybe I should bring him in and have him talk in this scene or do this or that in that scene, because, oh, this is this type of scene and I need a character who does this to be active here. And that's the whole plot of the story, though. So Darcy's sanctification becomes the plot of the story, but it's
Mm-hmm.
all wrapped around her character development.
And to kind of like, so bring this back full circle to where we started, this kind of like saturated with story world that we live in.
Yeah.
And really, like, when you look at it, stories in our world serve the individual.
Mm-hmm.
We're always trying to find a story that can make meaning for us, and really make meaning in such a way that it actualizes us, self-actualization.
Yeah.
It represents something. But I love the tandem, the parallel, the sort of a dialectic, to use a nice theological phrase, that you're running with, where it's like character driven and plot driven.
Yes.
And this sense of, design, no, it's not constrictive, no, and that's where some of the parallels between the narrator, the author, and the creator God break down. I mean, Jesus gives us this almost like fearsome free will, where you're like, you really trust us a lot. But
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, like, when we live aligned with the plot that God has, ordered into the world, then the story has this movement and this beauty. And I've tried to read James Joyce's Ulysses 40 times. It's like, it's fantastic in some ways. In other ways, it's not a book I keep picking up. Like, I love what it does with language, but that's sort of the extent of it. I'm not like, man, I feel so moved right now.
Yeah.
It's like I'm almost like, it's like watching somebody play really intense jazz or like prog rock, where you're like, I could never do that on a guitar. However, I'm not sure I'd ever want to.
Yeah.
But when I walk away from J.K. Rowling, or when I walk away from a world and you're like, that moved me, there was something
Mm-hmm.
going on. You talk about like a plot, like sanctification, like there's something incredible to that we can tell the story without having to, like, over spiritualize it. And I, probably for another time, would love to get your thoughts on Christian publishing and the way Christians approach fiction specifically, which is usually just full of like really bad metaphors. Right? It's like,
Yeah.
or like maybe not even quite metaphor. But that would probably take us into some cynical territory there.
Yeah, I
But
just published an article today. I don't know when you're going to post this podcast, but just today I published my column for Christ and Pop Culture, and called "Thinking Christianly," about telling stories, and I go into what you just mentioned.
That's excellent. We should Google that for sure. That's yeah, I'm just so fascinated by that, because we've seen, again, as you mentioned, like just the acceleration and the availability of story.
Yeah.
It almost becomes, like it almost becomes too much at some point. And like,
Yeah.
how do we curate that? Maybe it's not a great thing that Spotify can literally give us every song ever recorded. Like that level of freedom becomes constricting because it becomes paralyzing. And
Yeah.
so that element of plot driven, like what are we living into? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, it's amazing to me too how we have, I think people have lost the, speaking so generally, I was gonna say, I think people have lost the ability to determine what is a good story. That's so general
Yeah.
though. That's a throwaway thing that I just
So
said.
maybe the way to ask the question is what to you holds as a good story, and how can you call it good? I think we've lost the willingness to determine to say something is good and thus to say maybe some other things are not.
One of the problems is that we are a consumeristic culture, and so we just
Mm,
consume, and um, we it, people are always just looking for the next thing to. They're searching for a high, and maybe it's that same sense, that feeling, that I described as a child of getting to Narnia for the first time, as it were. And the Harry Potter generation who because Harry Potter really did capture that same feeling for many people. It's not always, there is a subjective side, of course, to art.
hmm
I will always maintain there's an objective nature to what makes art good. And for me, that largely is it true? Is it beautiful? And if it is true and it is beautiful, then we can call it good. Um,
hmm
but with so much at our fingertips all the time, and people always chasing after, um, we people get a book, they sit down, they read it in 4 hours. Okay, done with that. Next one, and they call everything good. Everything is 5 heart emojis, and you know, there's they don't really, but is it really that good? Like,
hmm
um, everybody loves everything 1,000 times, especially teenagers. Bless their hearts. I love them, but um, we need more. Um, we need more studies of the classics to be able to determine what's actually good and what's being published today. We need more studies of um, worldwide classics, and not just Western classics, but people need to read more widely from diverse authors around the world to get a more global perspective on uh, just a better global perspective on what is storytelling is, to be able
hmm
to better determine what makes a good story. And I think I lost track of what your actual question was and if I
That's all
answered
right.
it or not.
Yeah. No, I think that's it. Like, just what you said, I think is so helpful. Like, again, there's always a subjective element, but it's still like, how can we call something beautiful and true? And what does that say to its worth as a piece of art?
Yeah.
Um, I do want to, just because we have so many, where we are in Princeton, we have people that are just really, um, really intense on their disciplines, which is actually a really beautiful thing. So we have scientists that are getting PhDs and they're studying things I can't quite comprehend. We have classicists in our church, and I just love there's such a level of care and concern and love, and specifically for you, and just thinking about what does it mean to be an artist in the church. And so obviously you're a follower of Jesus. You go to church on Sundays. You happen to be a writer. For you, and maybe I'll ask the question two ways. Maybe we'll talk about the ideal. What should that be? And then maybe we'll talk about a little bit of your experience as your art has been received in the church communities that you have been a part of. So for you, like as you envision that, what could that be? Especially, I think it's important too with a medium like yours, because obviously if you're a musician, we'd be like, here's a microphone, do your thing, right?
Hmm.
But these these ways of telling the story that don't always fit nicely in our liturgical settings, whether that be, sort of high written prayer, whether it be pure, like kind of emotive praise and worship, like whatever, and whatever in between. Like, I think for you, like, how is that experience? What could that be? I guess we'll start there, and then we'll kind of get into what's been your lived experience.
Oh goodness. Being well, being a fiction writer, especially being a fantasy fiction writer, I don't know that there is a I don't know that there's a way for a fantasy fiction author to directly serve, the church, like the local church, doing directly what it is that I do.
Hmm.
I can't like sit down and write a novel for the church. I mean, I don't think so.
I
Now,
don't
are there
know. I think
way
that's isn't that Christian publishing? There's a lot of money in
well,
that, right?
they
Yeah.
no fantasy. That
Oh
magic.
no.
Um,
There's
that's
that one verse,
another discussion.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
Um, I think that now could serve the- however, um where it's kind of gotten me, I do think ideally it would be nice, um well, and well, here's where I kind of stumble over this a little bit though too, like, um I am and have been a public speaker. I have been brought in you know to conferences and um schools and libraries and things of that sort to to speak about writing, and to private Christian schools to speak about writing as a Christian writer and things of that sort. So someone like me, I ideally it would be nice to be supported and promoted, supported by a local church, um, in that regard, as someone
Mhm.
who has um, teaching gifts to offer, uh, in that sort of speaking environment, to be
Mhm.
considered for um, local. Um, I hate to even say this because God, my thinking on like events and stuff like that has been challenged a lot in the last few years, like women's specific events and things like that.
Mhm.
Ideally, it would just be
We're
nice.
we're uh we're an egalitarian situation,
Okay, I was
so
like,
feel free.
and I'm not even sure entirely where I land on all that anymore because it's
That's
just
totally
been
fine, but you don't need to
challenged.
walk on eggshells. My wife preached last week, so
Okay.
do with that what you will.
Um, and I was a girl who kind of went through a phase where when I was a kid, where I was like, "Oh, maybe I'll be a preacher someday," and was told I couldn't do that
Mm.
because I was a girl. So, that kind of abandoned
I'm
that.
sorry.
Well, I mean, I was really destined to be an author, so it's okay. But
It worked out.
it works out. But you know, I- it's hard for me to say what the ideal is because I don't know what it is, and it's not like
Mhm.
every person who is in any industry. It's like my husband's an auditor. It's not like he has to be supported as an auditor by the church, but um as far as the arts and artists are concerned, I know I definitely, you know don't want to be asked to do a bunch of writing for free, like which is what, like, and I say that in the regard that, like, I know that art, like actual like artists who create art and musicians are often asked to do stuff for free because the arts tend to be very devalued.
Mm.
Now, I'm happy to, volunteer services and as a way to serve the church. It's a different sort of thing to volunteer to serve as opposed to being asked to do work that you would be paid for,
Mhm.
in a professional environment. So that's kind of it's a tricky balance. Um, we were the church that we were members of for um, a decade down here. and this sound like I'm being like, oh, woe is me, I'm such a victim. But I mean, 10 years of women's ministry events and things like that. And they even did one event that I remember. I never felt at home in women's ministry events
Mm.
ever, though I'm just not that sort of woman. But 10 years of those sorts of events, they did one that was, the focus was on words and writing and things like that. And
Mhm.
I was it was well known that I was an author in the church, and I was never approached to speak or to contribute in any way.
Mhm.
Um, so that was always a little bit interesting. They did hire a church storyteller at one point. It was unclear what he was going to be doing, and I'm not sure what that
Mm.
was. But I wasn't asked to apply for the job, and it's not like they had to ask me to apply for the job,
Right.
but it felt
Right.
weird that it wasn't posted. It was just somebody who was a friend of the pastor who was hired.
Yeah, nobody does nepotism like the church, right?
Yeah, it was a little bit I'm not saying that with any hard feelings. I knew these
Yeah.
people. It was a head scratcher for me. It was like
Mhm.
I didn't really know what the job was. Um he was just hired on as the storyteller, and we had already been there for that was like near the end of our time, and I was like, well, I might have been interested in applying for that. And It was odd. I was asked to write Sunday school curriculum
Mm.
once, but technically I was not allowed to teach Sunday school without my husband being there as the quote unquote real teacher.
That is,
So,
fascinating in its own right. I'm interested in the theological, presuppositions there aside,
yes.
which, we don't hold, here, but the sense of, you know, for children, I think, we've talked a lot about your work honoring young people. And I think that's one of the beauty of, I've heard the love in your voice for your audience. But then specifically, like talking about like Sunday school curriculum, what was that experience like? If you could, I don't know. I'm sort of like, can you divest yourself from the very oppressive situation? Because clearly you can teach the Sunday school curriculum and as well as preach. So
Yeah, that was just there was I can't remember how many. I might have only done it the one time. It may have been more than one time. I'm not sure
Mm.
entirely. But we loosely taught Sunday school for like 4 years. I'm, you know, we're no longer at that church, so I'm just going to come out and be honest and say
Yeah.
my husband was not the teacher. I don't. We were in disobedience. Um, but I think God was okay with it. I
I'm
mean,
certain he is.
my husband sat in the front with me, but
Consider yourself absolved
thank
and
you.
never needing to ask for repentance. Yeah.
We have our gifts, and I was the classroom teacher for 10 years. I wrote
Yeah.
classroom curriculum, and I have the gift of teaching, and my husband does not, and that's okay.
Hmm.
We are we're given different gifts and abilities. Um but no, I mean the church did know that I was a writer, and they knew that this might sound prideful, but I had keen theological insight. Um
Hmm.
and so yeah, I was approached and asked to do um some curriculum writing for a series that they were doing. And it was like write a lesson. And again, I don't remember if I did that once or twice, and or maybe even three. I'm not even sure. A few times. And but when we were going to teach a Sunday school class, co-teach it with another couple, we were pulled into pastor's office, and it was made clear that the men would be in charge. So it had to be a co-teaching with the men situation.
You
The
know,
women could not teach men. It was a denominational thing,
yeah.
complementarian. And they're allowed to be complementarian, that's fine. But
Mhm.
it was just Sunday school. It wasn't preaching from the pulpit. So I
Yeah.
sound really bitter, don't I? I don't mean to sound bitter. It was just
No, it's,
it
one of the things
just
we've
the situation of being asked to write Sunday school curriculum that I was not allowed to teach.
yeah, again, cognitive dissonance doesn't ever, like we could talk about a lot of things where it's
Yeah.
like, but one of the things I have seen, and even up here in New Jersey, is sort of the aftermath, if you will, of the fallout of evangelical Christianity, and like
Yeah.
how truly like complex, like again, like at some, I know we're sort of dancing around having a little fun with it, but at some point it's like, no, it's really messed up and really sort of uh diminishing in a way, but
Right.
it's been a truly complex thing for a lot of people to unpack, and we've seen that pastorally. It's no, I don't think
Yeah.
you sound bitter at all. I think you're probably speaking to a lot of people's experience,
Yeah.
and hopefully even our just kind of like sitting here now is like, there's an absurdity there that should cause us to be like, are we sure?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, to get back around to the issue of being an artist in the church,
Hmm.
I can't separate the fact that as a writer, as a Christian, as all these things, I am also a woman in the church.
Mm.
And I've been all of these things as a woman in a conservative denomination in
Hmm.
the South, um, for 14 years. And it's just an irony. It's just ironic to me that, I've had so many people who have read my books within the church. We've been part of two different churches down here, same denomination.
Hmm.
People who've read and loved my books, and members of the church who've read and loved my books, who supported me personally. Mostly women. Women read a lot of young adult. Um, who yeah who've really really loved my work, but none of that personal support has extended to anything where the church has stepped out to support me either. Our current church is fantastic. They're a younger church plant, and I don't, when you're a church plant, you don't have a lot of resources. I don't expect anything, but
we know that life.
yeah, my and I know that the function of the church is not to support artists. Um,
Oh,
but if
well, it may not be primarily for that, but I think even talking about those issues of patronage and like what it means to, because again, like if we circle back to the idea of telling what's beautiful and good and true,
Yeah.
and we've been talking about literature, and specifically your writing, but all of this, we've talked about Genesis, and we could get into the gospel writer specifically, just as a case study, and just the level of, talk about planning and care. And now they're describing something that happened, so there's a constriction there, but I mean, John, for instance, the themes he's unpacking, and so you sort of think like the church we've always been a people of the book, a people of words, like that is sacred to us.
Yeah.
And we have to sort of patronize. Now, we're not writing new scripture, but at some level we're called to be seeing anew, like, talking about a journey of purification, sanctification. Like, we need to be re-immersed in what is good and beautiful and true. And so as I hear you talking, like, I sense this, like, no, I think, I mean, yes, obviously our point, like, let us worship God together. That's what we're here to do, and live the way of Jesus. But in the midst of that, it's like, what is going to actually sustain us on that journey? What is going to be, we don't live on bread alone, and allow God to speak to us in a fresh way.
Yeah.
I certainly think the artists among us are such a powerful voice in that, in a way that is unique. And I think that's okay for that vocation to have its own the way that it expresses that. So
Yeah.
yeah, I sort of hear you talking. I'm like, I'm really inspired to like, how do we excavate that in our community? And again, a church and the arts, like we get so utilitarians, like how can we make this mean something? It's like, is it good? Is it beautiful? Is it true? And perhaps that is enough to point to the God who made it all.
Yeah. Yeah. Art is vital to the life of the church.
Mm,
Um, it's vital to the, shaping culture and the sustainability of the church. Um, and it's really important to um, shaping women in the life of the church as
yeah.
well. Because women, um, I know that we're seeing a lot more stay-at-home dads these days. Well, everybody's stay at home right now, but eventually, I think work life will kind of shift back to the norm that we're used to, and still, even so, with everybody being at home taking care of the kids, still falls more on the shoulders of the women at home, even though the women at home are doing just as much work as the dads at home.
Mm,
Women are more likely to um, not have access to, well, getting back to that part of that conversation we had earlier about how young adult art is not taken as seriously
mm,
as adult art. It's not as intellectual and things like that. um, and something that I see down here in Alabama is a culture of women who just, they if they read at all,
mm,
it's young adult,
mm,
and that might be it. And or it's like they do that, and then they do magazines, and it's not that women are dumb, it's that they're just not being artistically ministered to. And
mm,
so um if the church is going to revitalize the arts, which is crucial, we need to see that. Women need to be involved. It can't be a bunch of white dudes sitting around at the church going, yeah, let's us form an arts council. There has to be women on it who say, this is how we reach other women. And
mhm.
childcare has to be involved. That's available to women. I mean, this is the pragmatic aspect of it. Like, people have to be available to watch kids for
Mhm,
women for free as a service of the church.
mhm. That's
So
really like that piece has been so evident. Like the whole church planning journey is always like we have a lot of kids at our church, and it's always been like, okay, how do we do this in a way that honors people, honors the kids,
mhm.
and honors the parents? And there's been times where we just haven't done that well, and it's been such a I just that ties a knot of anxiety even hearing you talk about it. So it's so important. I think talking about, and this is what really put me onto your work was your article in Christ and Pop Culture. I was watching WandaVision, and I'm not a I like the Avengers. I like the
Mhm.
Marvel on the screen. I don't know anything about the comics. So I know there's this whole world. I even had this experience where I didn't realize that on the WandaVision shows they were doing these things after the credits.
Mhm.
And so in the last episode, the White Vision shows up, which I don't think is a
Yeah.
huge spoiler. Just one of those things that
Not at
happens.
this point. Yeah.
And I'm sitting there, and my wife was watching it with me, and just kind of half-heartedly, and she goes, "Who's that guy?" And I said, "Honey, I have no idea who that guy is," because he had showed up in a previous episode that I had not watched the end of. But we talk about, especially as it relates to women, and this is what's so beautiful about the Gospels is Jesus, when he gets out of the grave on that Easter Sunday, the first word that he says is a woman's name.
Mhm.
The first word of the new world is a name. It's a woman's name, and even the way that that so subtly presses against the tropes that were present in that culture. And
Yeah.
you talked about this in your article, and I encourage everybody to go read it. Christ in Pop Culture. Just Google WandaVision, you'll
Yeah.
find that.
Yeah.
But it is that sense of like, Wanda is being allowed to not just be this hysterical woman who's seen great anguish and suffering,
Yeah.
but she is creating out of that.
Yeah.
And I thought that was such a powerful insight. And I had a few people, I shared that article around. Everybody loved the line,
Thanks.
"She's an Avenger, and Avengers assemble." Like, so great.
It was a
Um,
little cheesy, but I was like, I
but
have to use
it's
it.
like the right level of cheese, right? But
It is a
even
comic
talking,
book after all.
it is, and yeah, I've got a lot to learn in that respect. But even talking about, so like, obviously this last year, has kind of been encompassed, and we'll kind of end on this.
Mhm.
Has been a sense of like, and obviously different levels. We've all had different experiences with the pandemic, but there's been a collective grief,
Mhm.
and maybe even a collective denial of grief. I mean, we've 500,000 people in this country have died related to this virus, and I don't know if we're sure what to do with that as a culture. We kind of, oh, Oprah's interviewing the Royals. Okay, like,
Yeah.
let's focus on that. And so, how do you, as an artist, as somebody who, you don't have to go into your own experiences with grief, but understanding that this is the way that Jesus re-narrates the world is through suffering,
Mm.
and he invites us into that suffering. And you see this throughout his life. He stands at Lazarus's tomb and he weeps,
Mhm.
and out of the anguish, out of the depth of that grief, like, Jesus isn't just saying, "I'm weeping because you guys don't understand me, and like, I'm going to go resurrect Lazarus now." Like, Jesus enters into that, and
Yeah.
out of the depths of that anguish, there is new life creation. I think that's such a encapsulation of art, in the sense of like, through our brokenness, like, we are re-narrating the world. And so for you, as you sort of think about this last year, as you think about even like WandaVision, you kind of think about all these things that are kind of inputs. How do you understand like what it means for you to be a steward of that pain, and to kind of create from that place? How has that informed your work?
Grief, pain, all the big feelings. Um, the funny thing is, not funny, haha, but just kind of puzzling for me is that
Hmm.
I had the hardest time writing this past year that I've ever had in my entire life. Like I just felt completely stymied. Like I couldn't produce anything. I couldn't create. It was just like the like done, just tapped out. And I think it was because we'd never been through anything like what we all went through last year. I mean, collectively as a culture, we've never experienced what 2020 was. To me, it's still 2020. It's just
Right.
ongoing. It's persevering. But
Yeah. Well
but
played.
the when one of the comments I get from readers frequently, um, upon finishing when they finish the Gateway Chronicles, is that it helped them through some season of grief.
Hmm.
Um, those are difficult emails to get. I'll hear from like a 14-year-old who will be like, my dad just died 2 months ago, and I wasn't able to grieve until I read your books. Like,
Wow.
how do you respond? How do
Yeah.
you respond to that email? Um, Thank you. So, like,
Yeah.
um, and I went through some periods of grief when I was writing, but not like, I mean, the worst thing I went through when I was writing is I had a miscarriage, and that was as hard as
Hmm.
miscarriages ever are. But that was the only real huge life grief I had ever had. Aside from that, I didn't really know a lot about grief when I was writing the books. So it was really surprising to me that the most common feedback that I got was that the books were helping people through grief. And people were emailing me and saying, "How do you know so much about death? How do you know so much about
Mm,
sadness?" And I was like, "I really don't know. The grace of God, I guess. And maybe these books are meant to help people through, these sorts of times." I'm not
yeah.
I'm not sure. It was just really strange to me. Um and in 2017, my one of my closest friends died of brain cancer. And that was really obviously a terrible time of grieving. But I was still able to write. Like I took maybe 3 months where I didn't do much of anything. And then I continued to write between 2017 and now. I think I wrote 5 books. And
Yeah.
then and all my articles. And then 2020 hit and it was just like, I don't know what happened. Like, I mean, I was able to keep up with my articles barely, but I didn't write much of it. Like, I felt like my brain atrophied last year.
Mm,
It was like I was just walking around in a sea of fog. And I know that that's depression, but it was like, the kids came home and never left. We've all been stuck in this house for a year, and
yeah.
every aspect of my it, um like focus and energy has been on keeping them happy, and not like
Mm,
a false happy, but just like managing everybody else's mental health and well-being
yeah.
so that we all don't fall apart, you know so WandaVision, and other people have said this isn't an original thought to me.
Sure.
But WandaVision was like just the show I needed at the right time, because
Mm,
it was like a masterclass in how to grieve. It was like the stages of grief after all of this. And my grandfather died at the end of 2020. So that
mm,
was like the first floodgate. But
yeah.
I'm finally starting to feel like I can write again. And so when I wrote that article on WandaVision, it was like, oh yeah, emotions are healthy.
Mm,
Emotions are good. Out of emotion can come creation.
mm,
And as a writer, I don't have to be crippled by everything that's going on. Now obviously there's a lot of just busyness and distraction with having the kids in the house and
yeah.
homeschooling 4 children, and now trying to get the house ready to make a cross country move and all the things that we're doing. But
Yeah.
I'm back to actually planning a new novel and trying and writing and things of that sort that make me feel alive and make me feel like me.
Mhm.
And so the act of creation is tied to all the emotions and all the grief. You just have to, you know, open things up and let yourself go through the stages of grief and actually
Mhm.
feel the feelings that you need to feel. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think that's such a powerful just even a word as we sort of transition from this this 2020 persevering, and we have some signals of hope, culturally, that at least from the pandemic, and there may be some circumstances that are alleviating finally, but
Yeah.
just the sense of like allowing yourself to go through the stages of grief, and to trust that you're not broken, you're not like
Yeah.
there's not this thing that has been forever unplugged in your life, but that in order, the only way to get to the other side is through that sense. And I think you said that so well about WandaVision. It was sort of a masterclass in like trauma therapy. It was,
Yeah.
and for any of you who have seen the story, like she's been through a lot of people in her
Yeah.
life close to her have she's watched pass away. And so how do you reorder the world? And even like for her, like this sense of like creating order and beauty out of that, was really powerful. But I love what you said too about just giving yourself both the grace to understand the circumstances, like homeschooling 4 kids at home, in addition to everything else, but also knowing that there is um, there is a sense you know, of purpose that will be narrated on the other side of this,
Mhm.
that may, you know, come to a, you know, a conclusion that you would not have foreseen otherwise. But I think that the emotional element of this is so important. And I think especially like as a pastor, like I've talked to so many people recently who are just like the church thing. Like, I'm just not feeling it. And like I'm on the other end of the line, just like, yeah, me neither. Like this isn't church. Like we're watching a screen talking about consumers. Like it's
Yeah.
just insane. And so even the glimpses of hope that we might be together again and what that will look like. And yeah, sure, it may be different, but you know, that a new future will be born out of that grief and pain. I think that's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Katie, I just want to thank you. You know, we, as my conversations tend to do, I don't know about yours, we kind of meandered all over the place, and I
Yeah.
appreciate that very much. And just I appreciate your insight. I appreciate your work, and too, I think you've given us a vision for so many different things. Like, how do we honor artists in our midst? How do we honor women? What does it mean to tell stories that point to the beauty of Jesus without having to say it over and over again? I think that's such
Mhm.
a powerful thing to cultivate. It becomes an apologetic of beauty, which I think, you know, you talk about the world we live in, like there's just this competition of narratives and stories. Like the only thing that's going to break through is something truly transcendently beautiful.
Yeah.
And so how do we bear witness to that? Do you have any sort of last thoughts? I don't want to put you on the spot, but anything you're just like, if I could, you know, sort of tie a bow or say anything, I'd love to give you the last word. So if there's anything there, if not, we'll just edit it out. So
Well, I mean, I just want to say thanks for investing in reading, first book of the Gateway Chronicles.
yes.
Since I didn't get to say that earlier. And I hope that you continue. Put you on the spot.
And hell, I will. And you know, for me, it's like it's such a joy because, like, I mean, I mentioned to you earlier, like, our daughter's reading Narnia right now, and that's been the
Yeah.
gift to go back through. And so, like, going through this the first time, there's always this eye of like, at some point, like, I'll get to read this, and again, like, strong female characters. Like, there's just this beautiful vision too for them of like what it means for them to find their place in the world. And
Yeah.
I just appreciate that too about your work. There's a sense of strength attached to all the characters, especially the women. So appreciate
Well,
that.
thank you. Yeah. And
Yeah.
there aren't easy answers to a lot of the questions that you were asking me, because these
Yeah.
things, they just require a lot of discussion, and we're at a tricky point. I think we're kind of at a tipping point in the culture right now, as far as how Christians interact with culture,
Yeah.
and just a wholesale rejection of the culture war narrative, and trying to figure out, how do we do this thing called being a Christian artist, being a Christian who is an artist, who is a storyteller. How do we best honor God with our gifts,
Mm.
um, in the church and beyond? So I'm
Yeah.
still trying to figure it out, and I know a lot of other people are too. So I'm just happy that there's grace, for all of this, and for when I inevitably say something I shouldn't or make mistakes. I'm happy that there's grace to cover it.
Mm. Amen. Thank you. Thanks for that. It's such a beautiful vision. I appreciate that so much.
Thank you for
All right.
having me again. Thanks.